About 20 years ago, I decided it's time. So I began a research journey. And as it took me into my journey, I really believe the Lord led me to do the hard work to try to figure out how we could do what we now have, which is a book that seeks to do not only the storytelling, but to tell the times in which these women gave their witness. So, as I have done my research for the book, I track the times and the women. That's why it's called Ahead of Her Time. And the Pan African Women's vision, well, the vision of unity, mission, and justice of Pan African women, because of course the vision is greater than all of us. But in any case, in my research, I have discovered that the very genesis of the WCC has been rooted not only in the doctrinal, if you will, the kind of comprehensive ecumenical formation and faith and order perspective, but is also rooted in the social gospel that Dr. Vissertooth embraced at the very beginnings of the World Council of Churches. I believe that the context of these women's stories is historic to the very beginnings of the World Council of Churches. Some people forget that it was founded, the World Council of Churches, in 1948, in the throes after World War II, and very importantly, after World War I. And so the World Council of Churches had to identify the context it was in. And this is why I have decided in my leading that the women in this book had to be born before 1939. And so in that probing, I have discovered that there's been a long, very long lineage of the WCC facing the world for Christ, not just being inside of itself, but being external to the witness of the church in the world. So I believe that these women's stories are important to identify from the beginning of the modern ecumenical movement, and not recently, just recently, where I gave the Paul Watson lecture in the Chicago Theological Schools. I made the case since the Bible, since the biblical days. So these women's stories follow the alignment of church history, which the ecumenical movement is a part of. However, I do focus on the modern ecumenical movement, again, beginning more so in the early 1900s, coming into this moment. So yes, in this moment, we are speaking of the pilgrimage of justice and peace and reconciliation. Yes, we've been dealing with the pilgrimage justice in the last 7 years. Yes, we've had the decade to overcome violence. We've had any number of initiatives, the program to combat racism. But the point is that this is the story. This is a lineage. And anywhere you go, as I've read the history of World Council, we have been faithful to being a witness to the world and not just unto ourselves. What's been missing is the comprehensive stories of these women of Africa and of African descent who have been there since biblical times and have been there in the modern ecumenical movement. So I want to, of course, specifically embrace women and girls. They obviously are the target audience because it's part of their particular her story in the ecumenical movement. But this book is a book about church history. This is a book about ecumenical history. And I would like to think that our brethren would embrace it just as much as the women. Because in the end, that's what this book is about. It's about our story. It's about church history. It's about the ecumenical movement. And all of us should lay claim to this great legacy of these great women. So yes, a particular affinity and love for the women and the girls. But truly, the hope and the prayer is that we are rewriting the narrative of her story and his story together, and that the community of men and women, which WCC has rightfully named, will fully embrace what is here in this book. The book tries to capture a parallel alignment with what our history and her story has been. It is my hope and my prayer that these women in particular, and there's so many who I didn't have the time to document, and there are other documents, and I think it has a pretty good bibliography, have not been able to be featured the way my heart would have wanted them to be. But we did try to select at least a few parables that will at least give an illustration of what yet is there to be probed much more deeply. So the hope and the prayer is that men and women, young and old, and everyone else will find it in their hearts to receive what is there and to do much more than what I could do with limited time and resources. I need to say it was my mother initially. She always told me, don't forget the women. She said that to me all my life, don't forget the women. And then the mothers of the church and all the women who were in the church that I grew up, the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, in my local context. So it began as a child. And my godmother, who entered my story as a Pan-African woman from Liberia at the age of 6. That's where the seeds were planted early in my childhood.